What? A Puggitar video that's a reasonable length? And it's on an entire season of TV, not just one episode? Well, in light of the series of critiques I'm making on the first season of What If, I didn't want to leave you guys in the dark about my take on the second season. But I also didn't want to cover it in depth, because I don't care as much anymore, and already have too much to work on. Also, I'm putting gameplay footage in the background, other than when I need to show relevant clips, because I want to get this video out in a reasonable time frame. I'm gonna still be treating these episodes as branches off of the sacred timeline, and holding them to its continuity. Because even though the multiverse isn't shaped like this anymore, and is instead a tree now, trust me, if you don't know what I'm talking about, then you don't want to. That tree's skeleton is still the sacred timeline with a bunch of branches coming off of it. The Watcher continues to frame it the same way, and that's the entire point of the show. Seeing how things would be different from what we got, if this one specific thing were to change. So without further ado, let's go episode by episode, then talk about the season as a whole. I will be running through the plot of each episode, as this is basically going to be the type of critique I usually do, but shorter. So spoiler warning if you care. Although, in the description, I'll have a timestamp for my spoiler-free final verdict. Episode 1. What if Nebula joined the Nova Corps? Was bad. Big surprise, I know. Not particularly bad as far as episodes of What If go, but, well, that's not high praise. This episode is about a universe where Ronan betrayed and killed Thanos, leaving Nebula to get saved by the Nova Corps. Xandar was his next target, so while his forces were bringing Xandar to the verge of destruction, the Nova Corps locked down a planetary shield, so he would get stuck outside. Why wasn't his ship any closer? That's mighty lucky for the Nova that he parked right outside the shield and didn't attempt to come within the boundaries when he saw they were putting up a shield. We pick up 5 years later, where the isolation hasn't had the best effects on the people of the planet, and Yondu has been assassinated. Not like in episode 2 of season 1, but like, literally assassinated this time. Nebula wants to find his arrow, so she uses a hologram of him whistling to make his arrow fly over to her.
You and I, Debbie, we make quite the team. You and I, Debbie, we make quite the team.
This is just so dumb on so many levels. Surely the arrow isn't solely sound-based. Otherwise, anyone whistling could control it. The fin is necessary to control it, not just the whistling, as we saw in Guardians 2, where Yondu needed Groot to get the fin for him. And this hologram doesn't physically have the fin. And even if it was any whistle that could control it, I highly doubt this one specific whistle he did, being played repeatedly, would direct it straight to Nebula. Nebula opens it and there's some kind of schematic inside, which is very strange for Yondu's arrow. It's never been shown to work like that before, but alright. She visits Howard the Duck to figure out what's on the arrow, and displays in public this thing that probably should be kept top secret, considering Yondu gave his life to protect it. And only because she's doing this, Korg, who is bringing them their drinks, is able to shed light on it.
That's an old citywide mainframe core. It's a Unit B-42, I believe.
Because he just so happens to know that, I guess. Then he lists what's in it, which includes codes for the shield generator. So Nebula deduces that someone is making way for an invasion, so she needs to destroy the codes. To do this, she breaks out Yon-Rogg, and while they're escaping, she knocks over a robot and steals its tablet. This allows her to let all the prisoners out, and turn out the lights, which allows them to escape. They only escaped because the prison's robots, instead of directly interfacing with the prison's technology, have physical tablets they carry around that can be stolen. Sometimes it's funny how little the writers of this show try. They're able to make it to the core because Yon-Rogg makes it overheat, and the genius design is that when the core overheats, water from the surrounding area pours in through holes large enough for a person to fit through, defeating the point of the locked doors preventing people from getting in. Nebula connects to the core and copies the codes, deleting them from the core, but Yon-Rogg takes them from her because apparently she has a USB port in the side of her head. Then it's revealed that Nova Prime was behind this, because Xandar's deterioration under the shield made her want to open it, so she made a deal with Ronan that would keep her in charge after his invasion. So she somehow predicted not only that Nebula would be interested in finding the arrow, but would be able to somehow actually locate it, then find someone who could tell her what the schematic on it was for, then break out Yon-Rogg specifically to help her go access the core, and Instead of taking care of him or restraining him after he had exhausted his usefulness, letting him get the best of her while she's interfacing with the core. That's a lot of steps that have to go right for Nova Prime's plan to work, so...
Not a great plan.
But she's just extremely lucky, so it worked out. She set Nebula up like this because...
There was no way to access the data core without a cyborg.
Which is a bizarre design choice. The people who turned on the shield can't turn it off, but some unrelated cyborg can? And with that being the case, the Nova Corps don't keep a cyborg at their disposal specifically for interfacing with this thing? Seems like they made this up without putting too much thought into it because they wanted Nebula to have an active role in the plot. The Nova Corps then beats up Nebula, but she escapes. Howard the Duck and co fix her up. Then she convinces them to help, takes Yondu's fin, and goes to invade the Nova headquarters. She's already a pro with the arrow, even though Kraglin couldn't do much after practicing with it for longer than she did. We see that they already entered the codes, but Nebula apparently put a twist on the codes, so that they would open the shield briefly, then close it again. And she somehow knew the exact amount to open the shield before closing it, to catch Ronan off guard, so that he would have already started coming through, but only just enough that the fairly thin shield would crush his ship when it closes, rather than him being slightly faster and safely making it inside, because all of this wasn't already contrived enough. Also, the shield starts opening again after it closes, so Nebula had enough foresight to tamper with the codes ahead of time, but not enough to make sure the shield stays closed until she manually opens it, because with how it works right now, if Ronan hadn't started flying through yet when it started closing, he could just wait outside until it opens for good, and Xandar would be doomed. But because of the insane amounts of luck that our main characters had, the day is saved. Hooray! Well, that episode, like I said, was bad. But to be fair, as far as I can tell, nobody was character assassinated, which is a first for this show. All of the characters were still pretty dumb. Every plan any character in the episode makes is less of a plan and more of a, I hope these events I have no control over happen in a very specific way. And then they do. Which makes the plot really contrived on top of having multiple outright holes. And the world building of the prison's security, the Corps' security, and how the Corps and S.H.I.E.L.D. work are all poorly designed. Overall, despite not having any particularly bad character damage, I would still give this episode a 2 out of 10, because the plot is pretty awful. Episode 2, What If Peter Quill Attacked Earth's Mightiest Heroes, is not great either. The premise of this one is that Yondu, instead of keeping Peter away from Ego, gave him up. And we're seeing what happens on Earth in 1988 following that. A young Peter Quill shows up to Earth and just starts attacking people. I'm sure that'll make sense with more context. We look back to when Yondu handed him over, and Ego destroys Peter's Walkman. One of the most important things to him, because it was from his late mother. And Peter shows concern for like 2 seconds, not even saying a word before moving on. Yeah, I'm sure that's how the 8-year-old would react to that after recently watching his mother pass away. Back to the present, Peter is causing a ton of destruction, and he is said to have destroyed multiple solar systems. So S.H.I.E.L.D. is going to put together a team. The team includes Hank Pym's Ant-Man, Bill Foster's Goliath, T'Chaka's Black Panther, and the Winter Soldier, about whom Peggy and Howard say,
He looks just like him, Howard. Like Bucky.
I'd heard the rumors.
Sorry, rumors? There were rumors that Bucky was the Winter Soldier, but Nick Fury and Cap somehow never heard them? A major part of Captain America the Winter Soldier is that there was no reason for any of them to believe that the Winter Soldier was Bucky, making it a surprise when it's revealed. That doesn't really work if this rumor was going around. Also, Mar-Vell from Captain Marvel is here. Peter is still going around destroying stuff and ends up at Coney Island. While they're fighting him there, Mar-Vell somehow hacks Ego's ship. Weird that he would make technology other people could hack or even interface with, considering he could just control it using his powers, but whatever. Then Thor shows up and stops Peter, allowing them to lock him up. And Thor tells them that Peter already destroyed the other 8 realms, and tells them about the seedling from Guardians 2. He picked up Earth's. We learn that only a Celestial can destroy it, so they're keeping it in the hopes that Peter can destroy it. Every single character here is dumb for not wanting to get this thing off of Earth ASAP. Thor could fly out of the atmosphere and throw this thing off into space. Then Earth is no longer at risk of getting entirely consumed. Instead, they are risking the entire planet. We cut to Hope, who apparently stole Hank's keycard. Nice job, Hank. And she stumbles upon Peter, who acknowledges the importance of the Walkman his mom gave him.
That her Walkman? You're holding onto it pretty tight. I know if I still had mine, I'd probably be doing the same.
Didn't seem to care about it that much when Ego destroyed it, but alright. Hope realizes he's just a kid, and starts breaking him out. There's actually a moment of good character writing here, uncharacteristic for the show, but much appreciated, where Hope gives Janet's Walkman to Peter, and when he refuses, she says,
Look, it's a long ride to Missouri, and she'd be glad to know I'm sharing.
which is a neat little moment of Hope realizing that Peter needs it more than she does, and saying that her mom would be glad to see this, because she looked up to her so much. Nothing monumental, but it's a nice thing to see when the character writing is usually so lackluster in this show, and that's kind of an understatement. Hope tells them about Peter, and says,
Peter's not behind all this, it's his dad.
which you should keep in mind, because of a major issue in the episode that we'll talk about later. The team starts arguing about whether to kill Peter or not. Thor and Bucky want to, but everyone else disagrees. So a few of them go to find Peter. Ego is trying to connect with Peter, but it's not working. So Ego's tech tells him that Peter is on Earth. And like the line I mentioned previously, keep that in mind for later. Ego pursues him there, which starts to awaken the seedling, and still nobody suggests that they make Thor get rid of it. Also, Ego does the Cad Bane thing from Book of Boba Fett. The team that didn't go to find Peter fights against Ego, whose use of his insane power set is underwhelming, and he probably should have won here, but that was also the case in Guardians 2. Hank and Marvel found Peter, but so did Bucky, who was preparing to shoot him, but Stark convinces him not to. One afternoon is pretty ridiculously fast to overcome the brainwashing, but alright. Peter says,
Everything that's happening, it's not me. It's him. He has this power to get inside my head.
which again, we'll come back to. Peter also says,
I thought maybe if I came back here, I wouldn't feel so alone. But without my mom, it doesn't even feel like home anymore.
so he just forgot about his grandpa, and will continue to forget about his grandpa for the rest of the episode. That's very cool. Ego grabs the seedling, but then Quill and Hank show up right in the nick of time to take it from him. Then Peter absorbs it, which gives him enough power to kill Ego's human form. So the reason every character was dumb is that the writers needed them to be, so that the seedling would stay there and Peter could later absorb it. At the after party, Thor likes the beer, so he says,
Another!
but doesn't throw it on the ground. And this is blatant character assassination. I'm joking, but it's definitely strange that he doesn't. Also, Hank calls Thor
Goldilocks.
which was probably an intentional callback to episode 3 of last season.
Goldilocks?
Man, his voice acting in that episode is so funny. Ego's planet is still alive, so they all go off after that. Okay, so that episode was cool and all, but Hope and Peter himself brush off Peter's destructive actions onto Ego, when we clearly see that Ego wasn't in control of Peter. He didn't even know he was on Earth. So Peter was doing all of that of his own accord and is just evil? He acts in the scenes at the beginning like he is being mind-controlled. He never says any words or anything. But we know that's not possible, so Peter was actually just choosing to act like this. And yeah, that's pretty ridiculous, and along with the lack of reaction to the Walkman being destroyed, and him completely forgetting about his grandpa who's still alive, makes this a clear case of actual character assassination. With that, and everyone on the good side risking the entire Earth for no reason because the plot needed it, plus all the other smaller things, this episode is not stacking up very well. The plot progression is a bit more cohesive than the previous, but the characters are all pretty badly fumbled, so I'm going to give this one a 2 out of 10 as well. Episode 3, What If Happy Hogan Saved Christmas? Is not anything special either. This one takes place during the Avengers Christmas party in either 2013 or 2014. It's unclear, but definitely one of those two, because it's after Avengers, but before Age of Ultron. Jarvis is currently shut down for maintenance, and Justin Hammer is here, The change in this universe is kind of unclear, because the state of Justin Hammer in the MCU isn't touched on after the All Hail the King one-shot, where he is seen in prison, but that only takes place in early 2013. But whatever the change was, makes him come to crash this party. He steals a guy's tablet, then plugs his own device into it, which somehow allows him full control of everything in the building. We later learn that this is partially because Jarvis is offline, but still, I doubt he could hack this place when it's the most important place for Tony to keep secure. Then he's trying to find the Hulk blood Tony is experimenting on, so he can become a superhero. Happy grabs the Hulk blood, but it just so happens to land needle side down straight into his leg and then activate. So he slowly starts turning into the Amazing Bulk. And it's only after Happy sees an Avengers poster that he actually has the idea to call the Avengers, not much earlier when he saw Hammerhead invaded the building. Unfortunately, all of them are busy. Clint has the last Iron Man toy that's sold out, and isn't willing to give it to any of the children around him, which to me seems way too selfish for Clint, even if his wife asked him to get it for their kids. He personally knows Iron Man. Surely he could get better things than this toy for his kids. The kids around him need it more than he does. Also, Happy swings with a roll of spandex, which somehow doesn't get cut when he hits the bottom of the swing, even though the focal point is on broken glass. Darcy is trying to replace Jarvis with a backup, because apparently they have backups, but didn't activate one when temporarily turning Jarvis off. Eventually, Happy faces off against Hammer, who was ready to call in the Hulkbuster armor, but instead of already wearing it, he called it in after Happy got there, and it takes like 10 seconds for it to even get into the room. He's dumb for doing it like that, and Happy is dumb for not taking advantage of that. I guess Happy was just standing there 30 feet away from Hammer during the entire time it took for it to fly in. Then, after they fight for a while, the Avengers show up and immediately assume Happy is the only bad guy here, even though there's an unidentified person in the Hulkbuster armor, and nobody questions who that is. After everything gets sorted out, Thor shows up, and upon seeing Avengers Tower up in flames, his only reaction is,
"Oh, I missed the party."
Instead of showing any concern for his friends when they are nowhere to be seen, and something dire clearly happened here. This episode is definitely the new least bad so far, although I'd still place it at a 3 out of 10. Most of the characters are not as smart as they should be. The plot has a few issues. The state of Avengers Tower security is a pretty major problem. It's a bit weird that Hammer is already out of prison after what he did, and that Tony was able to make a better Hulk serum. But overall, not as poorly put together as any other episode of the series. Also, it has a bunch of references to Christmas movies shoved in. That doesn't affect my rating of it, but I thought I should mention it because it's a pretty major part of the episode. Episode 4, What If Iron Man Crashed into the Grandmaster, opens with a quick recap where the Watcher reminds us that last season, this Gamora showed up out of nowhere, and tells us that this episode is her backstory. In this universe, Tony didn't make it back to Earth in Avengers, which ended him up on Sakaar. Specifically, he fell into the Grandmaster's tower. That's not how it works. There are no trash portals anywhere over the city, because if there were, then things would fall on this tower all the time, and it would constantly need to be fixed up, which was not the case in Thor Ragnarok. The Grandmaster already knows who he is, because they get Earth news broadcasts here, apparently. But they still didn't know who Thor was. That's strange. Tony is threatened into staying there for the Grandmaster's birthday, which includes a race, which Valkyrie and Korg are taking part in. Okay, hold up. So in episode 1 of this season, Korg was on Xandar, which was a little weird, but I let it slide because Ragnarok leaves his past up in the air. We didn't know how long he had been on Sakaar, or where he was previously. But now, this straight up contradicts that, because Korg is here in 2012, which is before that episode which took place in 2014. This show just hates continuity. Tony doesn't like how dangerous the race is, so he goes to save Korg, and he suits up piece by piece, even though that wasn't a thing until Iron Man 3, which wouldn't have happened yet. Then Gamora shows up because she somehow heard Tony is here within the same day. Grandmaster locks them in the same room, and Tony gets rid of the little shocker thing by twisting his arc reactor. What was that? How did he know that would work? How can the arc reactor disable this thing but the lightning literally coursing through Thor's veins couldn't. Also, Gamora was trying to kill Tony. Then Korg held her back for like 5 seconds. Now she's not trying when a single punch from her would likely render him dead due to her superhuman strength. Tony is able to immediately hack all of this with just his wristband, because space tech is something his wristband can not only interface with, but beat the firewalls of. Mighty convenient that it worked out that way, when I highly doubt it would. When Gamora gets a gun, she waits to shoot until Tony is definitely aware, so that he can dodge and grab a device to shock her. How courteous of her to not shoot until he was aware that she was going to. He shocks her once, but after that, Gamora is still conscious. But instead of taking the chance while he's distracted and shooting him, she starts talking, which launches Tony into a rant, and this exchange.
You were lucky. Next time.
There won't be a next time, Xena.
Then he prepares to shock her again, but rethinks it and chooses not to. They frame this like Tony is about to kill her, but decides he doesn't want to. Except, this thing doesn't kill her, it just incapacitates her for a bit. Which is exactly what you need when she's trying to kill you. It's dumb that he doesn't activate it here. But lucky for him, Gamora doesn't pick her gun back up and try to shoot him, even though she has plenty of time to, and he is distracted by Korg at one point. This Gamora, whose sole goal is to kill Tony, really isn't doing a very good job of trying to kill Tony. Then Tony flies off with the goal of saving Sakaar, and recruits Valkyrie to help him do so. Gamora gets recaptured, and when Topaz comes to take her out of her cell, she says,
Don't try any silly stuff.
but then doesn't press the button when Gamora attacks them, because if she was competent, then Gamora wouldn't be able to escape, and the writers need her to. And also, the guards in the ship bay had shockers on them, just in case a prisoner showed up there, but the guards sent specifically to escort a prisoner don't have them. Topaz had the only one, because that makes sense. Tony challenges Grandmaster to a race for the planet, which he accepts. During this race, Tony argues Gamora into being on his side, which is fine. What he says is in character, and I think it's possible he could convince Gamora like this, considering the Guardians kind of did the same thing. Tony wins, but the Grandmaster argues it was a tie. Then, as Topaz is coming up, Valkyrie destroys her car, causing the melt stick to fly through the air and slowly roll across the ground and touch the Grandmaster's foot. They specifically show him looking down before it starts rolling, and yet he doesn't move out of the way, so he dies. They could have at least made it catch him off guard or something, instead of having him just stand here knowing if he doesn't move, he'll die. This causes the crowds to cheer for Valkyrie and crown her their king, which has some world-building implications. If the people of Sakaar basically unanimously hate the Grandmaster this much, that makes it ridiculous that he was still alive by the time of Thor Ragnarok. There would be constant assassination attempts, and his security is so lackluster that surely one would eventually work. The episode ends with Gamora bringing Tony to Thanos, but it was a trick. Gamora jumps towards Thanos, then Tony pulls out the melt stick and throws it to her, and she starts melting him with it. I don't know what this show has against Thanos. That's the 4th time they've killed him in 11 episodes, and in his other appearance, he was wildly out of character. That's not a great plan, by the way. That stick is super dangerous, and if it didn't flip the exact right amount, Gamora would have gotten melted. Why not just have her hold it as she jumps for Thanos? There's also a pointless end credit scene where the Grandmaster continues to melt. Surprisingly, we have another episode where no character is handled egregiously bad. Tony and Gamora, the main two, are handled fine outside of some actions that they should be too smart to have done. None of the characters are notably good though, and the plot is filled with illogical stuff to push it along, and multiple continuity errors as usual. So I'm going to be giving this one a 3 out of 10. Episode 5, What If Captain Carter Fought the Hydra Stomper, is a follow-up to the less than great Captain Carter episode from last season. I have a full video on that one, you should go check it out. This episode I surprisingly kind of liked on a first watch through. Let's see how well it holds up on a more thorough look. We start with this universe's version of the 2012 attack, where Peggy and Natasha are bantering, which is distracting them from the fight more than it should, and Wasp is there instead of Hulk. That is possible considering the change was so far back and was as important as Captain America being replaced. we pick up where the finale of last season left off, with Natasha and Peggy finding the Hydra Stomper on the ship they broke into. Them being there turns it on again, so they have to escape, and see that Steve is piloting it. They talk to Fury about this, because apparently the story he told her was that Bucky and Steve went around destroying every Hydra base, but Steve died on a mission in 1953. What he didn't tell her was that there have been rumors of his survival since the 60s. He follows up with,
"If the stories are true, then the Hydra Stomper is responsible for some of the world's worst acts of terror, which cost the lives of dozens of S.H.I.E.L.D. agents."
I find it strange that S.H.I.E.L.D., being an intelligence organization, had their own people attacked by this thing, yet have no evidence that it truly was the Hydra Stomper. Surely it would be easier to identify, and there would be more than just rumors and stories. Apparently the current rumor is that the Red Room has control of him. Fury then says that they've discovered his next target. So you'd think his next move would be to call in a few more or all of the Avengers, considering he describes the Hydra Stomper as
the world's most dangerous killer.
But nope, no more Avengers show up for the rest of the episode. Steve shows up to kill Bucky, but Peggy is able to shield him from the fire just in time. A fight ensues, and during it, we see that the Red Room painted red stars on the Stomper as an ingenious way of staying covert. The fight actually isn't so bad. There's some neat choreography here and there. Then it ends with the Hydra Stomper being disabled, and Peggy and Natasha flying off with it. Natasha explains that the suit is keeping him from aging and keeping him alive, which doesn't make sense considering it was the ice in tandem with the super serum that kept him alive in the main timeline. He's just a regular guy here. This suit shouldn't be able to keep him alive. Peggy decides to go after the Red Room to find a cure for Steve, but they're keeping the dumb plot point from Black Widow, where nobody knows where it is, even though there's no way they're keeping the location of that thing a secret. Steve wakes up and is acting like Steve again, so they follow him to the Red Room, which is above a fake American town. They have a bit of time before the Red Room gets there, so Steve and Peggy talk. Steve describes being under the serum as
like watching the world through fogged glass,
which is kind of similar to what Yelena describes in Black Widow, but a bit different, which is a possible result of the many changes that would spawn off of the one change from the first Captain Carter episode. Peggy describes her experience.
I stepped through a door. In one breath, the war was over and the future was here.
The change must have been pretty jarring for her, so Steve asks,
"So, what do you think of the future?"
And she responds,
"In a word, faster. Cars, computers, even the news moves fast."
Which is an interesting perspective for her to have, that I like a lot. As time goes on, time becomes more and more of a precious thing that we want to have more of by speeding things up. Something that someone who lost 70 years would probably pick up on when arriving in what to her is the future. And Steve, in a much appreciated contrast to last episode, brings up dancing in a relevant way.
And, the dancing?
Because that's something these two talked about all the way back in 1943, that he thinks won't have changed in the way she's seeing everything else change. And he's right.
Still slow.
Which shows that things like dancing have stayed mostly the same, and can give her a break from this new world that's faster than she's used to, while also being a little joke about slow dancing. Maybe I'm reading into it too much, but I just really like this dialogue. Animatronics with a baby walk by, which prompts Peggy to say,
"You could have had that. After the war, a wife, kids, the whole white picket fence life. Barnes did."
Fury worded it weirdly, but her saying this makes me think that Steve and Bucky took out every Hydra base. Then afterwards, Bucky settled down to have a family, but Steve chose to continue going on other missions as the Hydra Stomper until his supposed death in 1953. This creates a contrast between Bucky and Steve. Bucky by that point had seen his fight through to the end, and was willing to give it up. And Steve can appreciate the life his friend got.
Good for him.
But didn't end up doing the same. Peggy didn't just want his appreciation of that, though. She wanted an explanation for why he kept doing what he did.
Steve.
So he gives one.
I didn't see much point, unless it was with you.
He wouldn't want to start a family just for the sake of having one. If he were to, it would be so that he could spend his life with Peggy, something he never got the chance to do because she went through that portal. He tells her what he ended up doing instead.
I spent years going after Hydra. As long as I was on a mission, I could pretend you weren't gone.
So serving as the Hydra Stomper was not only the way that he could see his life as having a point compared to starting a family, which wasn't something he saw much point in, it was also the way he could keep his mind off of what he had lost. Looking back, he thinks,
It's crazy.
But Peggy reassures him.
No, not crazy. Very human, actually.
She sees Steve's loyalty for what it is, and views the way he dealt with losing her as a very human thing to do. He then says,
But you're here now.
And she responds,
Finally.
A sentiment they also showed with an earlier exchange.
We have a little time.
That's a first.
This scene wasn't anything mind-blowing, but I just wanted to give a quick analysis of it to show that this episode actually fleshes out their relationship and gives it depth that lines up with their characterization, in a way the first Captain Carter episode failed to, and most episodes of this show fail to do with their characters. I understand that in 30 minutes you're not going to achieve a massive amount, but I'm not expecting them to. A few lines of dialogue like this can convey a lot if they put effort into writing them. But right as Peggy and Steve are about to kiss, Peggy gets hit by a widow bite, and they turn to see all the animatronic humans readying to shoot at them. Don't know why it was designed so that one would shoot her a single time, then they would all wait a bit before opening fire, but alright. A scene of them fighting the robots ensues, which is pretty fun I guess, but Peggy gets hit with so many widow bites, which should have a greater effect on her, considering how she reacted to getting hit by one. Natasha tanks a bunch as well, until all of a sudden she collapses because they actually start affecting her. After the fight, all of the animatronics pull back, as Melina and some Black Widows arrive, and she reveals that Steve was under mind control the whole time. His real goal wasn't to kill Bucky, but rather to bring Peggy and Natasha here, which was a strange plan on Melina's part. I don't know how she expected it to turn out this way, when Fury didn't even want Peggy going after the Hydra Stomper, and any number of things. For example, another Avenger showing up, or Peggy listening to Fury and staying out of the fight, could have resulted in Steve either being beaten, or the outcome of the fight being different. I wouldn't say Peggy and Natasha flying Steve off to a remote location was a likely outcome someone could have predicted from this fight. It's more well put together than some of the other plans we've seen this season, but still, not what you should expect from the head of an organization of spies. Peggy fights Steve, and Natasha fights the Widows, and continues to have a ton of plot armor. Natasha eventually gets hold of one of the animatronic hands, and can apparently operate it, so she shoots the Widows she was fighting, and they all drop immediately, even though she tanked them for a long while. For no reason at all, she doesn't shoot at Melina, so she gets attacked. Peggy somehow survives a car exploding on her, then starts to break through to Steve, while Melina is beating Natasha until she starts strangling her. Steve finally breaks out of the mind control, which is lucky, but I'm fine with it being possible, because it's possible that a chain of events caused by the initial change in this universe ended up with the mind control they invented not being as effective as it was in the Black Widow movie. He flies up to destroy the Red Room. Natasha grapples Melina onto him, then they fly into it, blowing everything up. A ton of debris falls, and Natasha's plot armor continues to prevail, as none of it hits her, and Peggy is able to bring her to the Quinjet and they just barely escape. The episode ends with Peggy getting pulled through a red portal, and ending up in what seems to be the 1602 episode happening later this season. Well, the plot of that one was fairly bad, and the action scenes, while fun, didn't always make the most sense. But that episode overall wasn't so horrible. At the very least, they just made Melina outright evil, instead of being a terrible person that none of the characters acknowledge as such. No characters were done awfully, and there were some interesting and well-founded bits of character writing here, as much as the characters continue to make a few baffling choices throughout the whole thing. My view of this episode may be rose-tinted due to how awful the Captain Carter episode was last season, but at the moment I kind of enjoyed this one, and would consider it the best of the show so far. I'm going to be giving it a 4 out of 10. Episode 6. What if the Tesseract fell to Earth and landed in the sovereign Haudenosaunee Confederacy before the colonization of America? Oh wait, it's not called that anymore. Episode 6. What if Kahori reshaped the world? To me seemed like it had the most interesting premise. It was so open-ended that they could have done any number of things, yet it ended up being the least interesting episode here, so it's the one I'm going to spend the least time talking about. The other episodes of the show are at least interestingly bad. This one is just boringly bad to me. Basically, Ragnarok happens early, the Tesseract falls to pre-colonial America and creates a lake which transported many Native Americans in the area to a place they call Skyworld, and gave them powers. Because apparently the Tesseract just gives out random powers that are completely different from the ones it gave Captain Marvel. Many years later, our main character Kahori falls into this lake, and in a few hours, gains more control and strength with her powers than the people who have been there for years. Then she and the rest of them save her people from the cartoonishly evil Spanish conquistadors, who came in search of the Fountain of Youth. The plot just contorts to her favor. With the power set she gains and all the other people from Skyworld to help her, there's not even a struggle in their battle against the Spanish. And the thing the Watcher praises her for, that he says led to her victory,
she remained true to her course, unwavering in the face of both devastation and miracles alike,
isn't even true. There's a whole part in the middle of the episode where she completely forgets about wanting to save her village, which doesn't really fit the character she was established to be, by the way. After they beat the Spanish in America, we see the Queen of Spain, and Kahori and the others just portal into the room. No idea how they pinpointed this exact location, but after she destroys the throne, Strange Supreme shows up, setting up for the final episode of the season. At the moment, I'd place it at a 3 out of 10, because the plot is contrived due to how perfectly everything works out for Kahori, and how fast she's an expert with these powers. Plus, our main character is bland with a side of inconsistency, and the rest of the characters are pretty empty or cartoonishly evil. And I'm aware that this is a cartoon, but it's in continuity with real universes full of people who act like real people, or at least are supposed to. So I'm not letting that slide. This episode is fully voiced in Mohawk, with the exception of the Watcher and Strange who speak English, and the Spanish people, as well as Kahori at the end, who speak Spanish, with white and yellow subtitles for Mohawk and Spanish respectively, to show which language is currently being spoken. That, plus the other elements of Mohawk culture they included, certainly are pretty cool, but inclusion doesn't save a poorly put together story. It'd be cooler if they did both. Episode 7, What If Hela Found the 10 Rings, takes place in a universe where instead of banishing Hela to Hell, Odin destroys Mjolnir, which is needlessly wasteful by the way, that's a very useful weapon, then banishes Hela to Earth, removes her powers, and limits her crown to be used by those who are worthy, similar to what he did to Thor in Thor. When the crown lands, it gets found by Wenwu. Then Hela walks up and catches his attention. She speaks Chinese apparently, but Wenwu speaks to her in English, so she continues the conversation in English, which shows us that Hela in this episode is everything people accuse MCU dialogue of being.
I'm not most people. I'm the goddess of death. That usually gets a bigger reaction. Well, ugh.
Then underpowered Hela gets attacked by Wenwu's troops, who draw blood, so she's a regular human now like Thor was in Thor. Yet she still beats hordes of armed people, in a terribly choreographed fight, where any form of contact immediately knocks each soldier out. Wenwu restrains her, then brings her to her crown, and she can't pick it up. Then Wenwu proposes an alliance, and he says that he gives back to the world
by protecting them,
and words his offer as,
together we can protect the world.
Also, he has already fallen in love with Hela, which I can't say is out of character, but that blatant change of his motivation absolutely is. We were told in Shang-Chi by the person who had every reason to see the good in him that he could have used the rings for good, but all he wanted was power, and his actions were chasing money and power. So yeah, this is just antithetical to the actual character of Wenwu. Then Hela beats him up and runs away. As she is running, she just so happens to fall through the ceiling into the room Morris is in, and he guides her to the enchanted forest, then through it. Then she gets beaten up by a woman from Ta Lo and is brought there. When introducing herself, we get more cringe dialogue from Hela.
My quarrel's with a man named Wenwu. Well, technically it's with my father. I guess you could say it was both of them.
Then she continues to ramble on, but showing you that would make the clip get caught by Content ID. And trust me, you don't want to hear it anyway. Then they decide to train Hela, and because she's in Ta Lo, Heimdall can't see her and thinks she's dead. Hela is put through training, then is asked a bunch of questions about her motivation, until she arrives at the conclusion that her underlying motivation is to gain freedom. It's really not that deep. What she wants is to conquer, and that's all there is to it. She makes that very clear in Thor Ragnarok. But this supposed realization helps her with her training. Then she sees the Bifrost because Odin is arriving on Earth. But that's not possible. Ta Lo isn't simply on Earth. It's referred to in the movie as another universe, although it's probably more accurately another dimension, but I digress. She could not see the Bifrost from here, and the writers should have known that, considering they wrote Heimdall losing his sight of her when she went to Ta Lo. This is just a straight up plot hole. Plus, if we ignore how it's even possible, it's lucky that she was looking the right way at the right time, because the Bifrost doesn't take very long before it's over. She goes back to Earth to fight the Asgardians alongside Wenwu. Then Odin shows up personally to fight them. Odin then asks her to join him again, even though she hasn't proven herself worthy, which is weird, but she refuses. They start to fight, and Hela faces Odin hand to hand and tanks kicks from him, even though he's at full strength and she was reduced to human strength and durability. The power scaling here is way off. Then Hela, with a chance to kill Odin, doesn't, and that earns her her crown back and a new white outfit, and she decides to change Asgard's empire from one of conquering to one of liberation and peace. This is like Loki in the Loki show. They just changed her into the opposite character with no legwork. Hela would not be like this after spending just a few days in Ta Lo, with Hela and Wenwu being character assassinated like this because their motivations are entirely changed, and they just don't act like themselves. The awful dialogue isn't helping them either, and Odin acting a bit weird as well, and the plot falling apart at points. This episode is another that I'm giving a 2 out of 10. Episode 8. What if the Avengers assembled in 1602? Had a premise that seems like it didn't make any sense, and who could have guessed? It ended up not making sense, although it also ended up having more to appreciate than I expected. We open with Loki performing Hamlet until the sky opens up. Loki starts getting sucked in. Then Captain Carter pulls him down with a rope, which makes him stop getting sucked into the rift somehow. After that, Hela gets pulled in, and Peggy tries to save her but fails to, so Thor is king now. He thinks Peggy is cursed because the rifts have been getting worse since she arrived, so he orders his guards to capture her and she escapes. As the Watcher explains the situation, Peggy reveals that she can hear him, which is a bit weird, but I'd say it's fine because he revealed himself to her before, so she knows of his existence, and that's probably why. Peggy's theory is that
2 time periods, the 1600s and the early 21st century, have been compressed.
And if she doesn't fix that, then the universe will end. The Watcher offers to bring her back because
worlds die every day. I've watched millions fade from existence.
So he's willing to let the same happen to this one. But he likes Peggy and is willing to save her if she wants. Peggy is too determined to take his offer and just leave.
Well, not on my watch.
I like how she worded that, contrasting how the Watcher handles things. She's not prone to step back and just watch from afar so easily. Wanda tells Thor that the rifts are caused not by Peggy, but by a person lost in time, who she calls the Forerunner. Peggy overhears this and gets Tony to help her solve this. The skull she stole from Loki has some weird particles on it from the rift, so they're going to use that to find the Forerunner. To make a device to trace this, Tony needs the stone from the scepter to power it. To help steal it, Peggy finds this universe's Steve, aka Roger's Hood. We get another neat Steve-Peggy scene. Steve says,
"Most people would be driven half mad at the mere idea of being stranded in a foreign world."
Acknowledging Peggy's bravery and determination to not only be okay with being here, but be willing to try to save it. She responds,
At this point, being in the wrong place at the wrong time is my specialty.
Because she's already been pushed forward 70 years, then taken out of her universe to save the multiverse, before being pulled here. She's used to it at this point, and is willing to help in whatever situation she's put in. Steve asks,
"In your world, is there another Steve Rogers?"
Because this world had a Margaret Carter who died. And Peggy responds,
Yes.
So Steve says,
"Tell me what he's like."
But Peggy then responds,
No, I don't think I will.
She said the line.
No, I don't think I will.
In that scene, Steve was refusing to talk about Peggy. Now the script is flipped, and Peggy isn't willing to talk about Steve. It's information that she doesn't need to share, and she probably thinks this Steve is better off without knowing about the other versions of himself, so that he can just live his own life. No need to get lost in the what-ifs. She asks,
Will you help me? I know I'm not your Peggy.
knowing that even though she looks familiar, she's basically a stranger. But to Steve, that doesn't matter.
My Margaret would want to save this world too.
Because even if she's not the same person, he sees the same heroic qualities in this Peggy as his own Margaret, and references her line from earlier in the conversation.
That was her specialty.
Again, nothing groundbreaking here, but it's a neat little exchange. It builds upon Peggy's characterization and forms an interesting relationship between these two characters. Because even though they don't know each other, the alternate versions of each other they knew can shed some light upon what the person they're looking at right now is like. But we can't be doing good character writing for too long. This is What If. So a tiny man jumps in, then a bunch of tiny men jump in. Because Thor has yellow jackets at his disposal apparently. How did they make this tech in 1602? There's no way they have this, but everything else is still medieval. Scott has this tech too somehow. Also, Peggy and Steve just stop fighting to talk for a second in the middle of the fight multiple times, and don't get attacked for it. The incinerator is here, and Peggy offers to distract it so Steve and the others can go steal the scepter. Then she gets captured. While she's in her cell, she speaks with Uatu, who tells her this universe is destined to die. So she says,
If you see someone hurt, you help them.
Because to her, it's as simple as that. Being a hero is about helping the people who are hurt, no matter what. Uatu responds,
A piece of advice from an all-seeing being. You cannot possibly comprehend the consequences of your actions.
And he's right. There are stakes here that she doesn't fully understand, even if what she thinks she's doing will help.
Even if you find and destroy this Forerunner, what happens next? What if the world doesn't magically correct itself?
Because there's no guarantee that what she's trying to do will actually fix anything, he sees it as naive for her to think it will. He goes on,
What if it's the final straw that destroys this universe?
Because she could be ending the universe with her actions for all she knows.
What if, when the universe resets, you're trapped here forever? What if you die?
All of these are very real possibilities. Reasons the Watcher would rather she step out and let this universe's death run its course. He doesn't want to see any of these possibilities happen to her. And yet, Peggy doesn't care.
What if, what if, what if? I have to try.
Because if this universe is doomed to end, and she has a chance of stopping that, she believes that she needs to take it. The Watcher responds,
Because you're human.
Almost degradingly. She has not seen the things that he's seen, and thus has a hope that he thinks is misplaced. But for Peggy, it's not simply because of that. It's because of the person she is.
Because I'm Captain Carter.
She's a hero that was brought here to save this universe. So that's what she's going to try to do.
And if you're not going to help me, get out of my way.
This scene creates a great contrast between the two. And I like the use of what if being a question Uatu can't escape, because he's seen so many possibilities. A clever play on the name and idea of the show. While Captain Carter ignores the what ifs to focus on what she can do. In a way, Captain Carter this season is the antithesis to What If, and maybe that's why she's well written. She finds Banner's cell, makes some guards shoot at it, and they shoot for way too long after she moves out of the way. And this causes Banner to Hulk out and break out. She rides on his back to escape and reach Tony, who shows her the device he created to find and return the Forerunner. Then Steve and company show up as well. Their plan is to show up during the next court session to steal the scepter. While they're there, a rift opens, so Wanda tries to hold it closed. Then a fight breaks out and they try to get the scepter. Eventually they do, and they activate Stark's machine, which gives Peggy a gauntlet and reveals that Steve is the Forerunner, which also somehow makes him remember how this happened. He hit the Time Stone during Infinity War, and that's what caused all of this. We'll come back to that. Peggy says the same thing she said in episode 5.
Steve, I can't lose you again. I can't lose you again.
Because it's happened to her so many times already. But Steve says,
We both know what I need to do.
And she agrees, but it's still hard for her.
It never gets easier.
She points out how this is what always seems to happen for her and Steve.
We never get our happy ending.
Because this is how it's ended every time for her. Steve, knowing about the multiverse, responds,
I'm sure somewhere out there. We do.
Before touching the stone and fixing everything, leaving Peggy behind. It's way better than Multiverse of Madness's insane idea that Steven loves Christine in every universe, along with the implication that he doesn't get to be with her in any. This may seem like what's doomed to happen to Steve and Peggy as far as these two have experienced, but they can also be sure that because of the nature of the multiverse, somewhere out there, they do get their happy ending. But back on the plot stuff, it doesn't make any sense. Just hitting the time stone screwed with the entire timeline so that these people ended up in 1602? Why does this show keep adding random insane powers to the time stone? If it was during Infinity War, after Hela and Loki already died, how were they here? And like I mentioned earlier, the mismatch of tech levels doesn't make sense. This whole idea is just broken, and I don't know how Steve touching the time stone would magically fix the timeline. Also, the rifts are never explained. They just kind of happened because of this, and now that it's fixed, they're not going to happen anymore, I guess. And when he does magically fix it, all of the effects of the people being here get undone. Except Peggy still has the stuff she was given by the transplanted people. How? After that, Strange Supreme shows up to set up for the final episode. Then it's over. I talked a lot about what this episode did well, but overall, this plot is pretty insanely busted, and is probably more broken than I'd like to delve into, because I'm not making a long video on this episode. The good stuff doesn't make up a large portion of the episode, but it is there, and it's hard to judge exactly how much other characters are supposed to be their regular selves. So it's hard to judge whether characters are written out of character, or just different because of the time transplanting. The characters that are there don't always make a whole lot of sense. Like, why doesn't Wanda summon more people than just Peggy to help? And if Thor thinks Peggy failed, why doesn't he ask Wanda to summon more? A large portion of this episode is fights that aren't particularly well done, and a plot that doesn't make any sense. The highs and lows of this episode make it hard to rank, but I'm gonna put it at a tentative 3 out of 10. Episode 9, What If Strange Supreme Intervened? Opens with a unique What If themed Marvel Studios intro, which is kinda cool. Then we're back where the last episode left off. Strange Supreme brings Peggy to his headquarters, the Sanctum Infinitum, where he stores universe killers that he's captured. Strange says one has gotten out, and asks Peggy to help him save the world or several, and her response is,
No, I can already hear the Watcher intoning that meddling in the multiverse is always a mistake.
which is the opposite of her entire character this season. She disagrees with the Watcher on that point, so she shouldn't be siding with him here, she should be willing to help. It's only after Strange points out that she saved 1602 that she's willing to help, which is bizarre. When Peggy is about to go, she asks Strange,
Wait, Strange, why can't you just do this?
and he responds,
Because you, my friend, are an unknown. She'll see me coming a mile off.
which still doesn't answer why he got Peggy rather than any more powerful being out there in the multiverse that would be willing to help him. When the Watcher shows up, Peggy, in an accusatory tone, asks,
You here to help for a change, or just to narrate?
which is pretty hypocritical considering she just refused to help and cited Uatu as the authority that would agree with her. Then the person Peggy is looking for shows up. It's Kahori. And while she's super speeding around, Peggy somehow hits her with the shield. As they talk, Kahori says Strange is lying. Then Strange pulls them back to the Sanctum. If Kahori knows to stay on the move to avoid him, why is she just standing here talking with Peggy? And when they see that Strange is portaling them back, she shouts,
Peggy Moss!
Despite not using her super speed to save both of them. Strange starts attacking Kahori, and she starts telling Peggy about a forge Strange is feeding people, good and bad, from across the multiverse into, to resurrect his universe. I have no idea how she figured this out. There isn't really a way for her to figure out that in the past he ended his own universe, without him telling her, which he definitely wouldn't. And I don't know how she figured out what the forge does, either. Peggy lets out a bunch of people Strange has trapped to distract him, and they all start fighting each other for no reason. Then her and Kahori escape amongst the chaos. As they're doing this, they run into Thanos with the stones, who just holds onto Peggy's shield without actually using any of the stones, so he gets snapped by Killmonger from last season. Except he isn't even a character anymore. He doesn't say any words or attack them, he just stands there until Kahori portals him away and Peggy takes the stones. They fight Strange, and the fight is really bad, but I don't want to criticize it in depth because we'd be here all day. Partway through it, Strange portals everyone he captured to fall into the Forge. Multiple people there have the ability to fly, but they just allow themselves to fall towards it instead. Kahori portals them home because she can do that, I guess. Peggy punches Strange with all 6 Infinity Stones in her bare hand and doesn't die, which just should not be possible. She shouldn't even be able to hold one. Eventually we get the explanation for why Strange is doing this.
My grief is too strong.
And apparently it's become a separate entity that controls him. Peggy knocks him into the Forge, and that's that. Doing that recreated a version of his universe where he was never born. I guess he did it that way so that he could enter into it and be the only Stephen Strange. His motivation to do this doesn't make any sense. There would be universes out there in the multiverse just like this one that already exist. He doesn't need to go through all the effort of capturing so many powerful beings to create a new one. I could have talked about this episode for far longer, because basically everything that happens is void of logic, but it's not really worth it and I'd like to get this video over with. They screwed up what Peggy had going on this season with that part at the start where she refused to help. And Kahori continues to be Kahori, except her power levels grow by the second, and she's now among the strongest in the MCU. Probably even stronger than Thanos with all 6 Infinity Stones. Strange Supreme isn't consistent with his already poorly done characterization last season. I have a full video on his episode, you should go check it out. And the plot was nonsense the whole way through. Though for as nonsensical as this episode was, it doesn't have any universe-breaking issues like multiple episodes of last season do, so the plot isn't quite as bad as it could be. So I'm going to be giving this one a 2 out of 10. I'm just disappointed that the previous episode set up some actually interesting stuff in terms of character conflict and thematics, but this episode mostly drops that and does nothing with it. With Peggy's conversation with the Watcher in the cell last episode, they presented a debate that's important to the show as a whole, in terms of whether it's worth it to get involved in the multiverse when parts of it are in danger, or whether to stay back because of all the possible ways your attempt could go wrong. In a way, the conclusion of that conversation, and then the whole episode, because Peggy prevailed, was not to ask what if, which could have been an extremely interesting direction to go in were they to follow it in this episode. If they did continue that idea, bring it to a conclusion nicely in this episode, then end the show there, I would be willing to commend it for, despite its faults, having a well thought out and interesting idea behind its conclusion. Having the What If show conclude that it doesn't really help to ask what if, then end and have no more seasons, would have given it something worthwhile in my opinion, even if it didn't save the show from its many other faults, especially those of last season. But it didn't do that, and we have at least one more season on the way. This was just a lame finale. Alongside all of its own issues, it only really builds off of 3 of the previous 8 episodes, then the others show up as cameos at most, and it failed to pay off what 2 of those 3 episodes set up. And that's all the episode's done. Hello, spoiler-free people. So this season, as a whole, was no doubt an improvement compared to the awful last season, and it got my hopes up a little bit partway through, but it ended up disappointing me by the end. Similar to last season, there were a ton of continuity errors, plot holes, and contrivances to push the plots along, plus world building that is often very poorly thought out. Nothing as bad as the worst of last season, but it's still not holding up very well. In terms of characters, there are a bunch that are mishandled, but they also more often got characters right, or at least ruined them less, this season, and even improved upon a character from last season, although in the end what they did ended up being fumbled. Keep in mind though, I consider Season 1 of What If to be the second worst thing I've ever seen, so being better than it is not much of an achievement. By the close of Episode 8, I was on the edge between giving this season a 2 or a 3, but that final episode really damaged the show as a whole, so my final score for this season overall is a 2 out of 10. Although my take on each episode and the season as a whole aren't as set in stone as my takes in my other videos are, because this series is so new. I haven't had as much time to think about it yet. I wouldn't consider it worth watching, but if you're going to watch any of it, I would say only watch episodes 5 and 8. They're certainly not good, but they have some good stuff in them. And if you do, absolutely do not watch episode 9. Imagine your own version of what it could be, your own what if. Because trust me, after watching episodes 5 and 8, episode 9 managed to be a major letdown in terms of being the conclusion to what happens in those previous episodes. This season is just a continued part of the MCU since Captain Marvel, being bad with almost perfect consistency, even if it's less bad than the previous season. And I guess it ended up being better because after doing season 1, the writers were more seasoned veterans. Well, that's all I had to say about season 2 of What If. Now I can never think about it again. And as always, thanks for watching.